short disclaimer before jumping into the podcast. The views and opinions expressed by the interview guest in this podcast are solely their own and do not in any way represent the views, opinions or positions of any organization with which the guest is or has been affiliated. All statements made by the guest reflect their personal standpoint only. Hi, welcome and grüezi to a new episode of Governance Unplugged, where today we are diving into a topic that sits at the heart of good governance: the relationship between internal audit and audit committees. And in particular, we will be discussing, number one, what should audit committees be asking internal audit? Number two, are they getting the right information to truly challenge and guide? And number three, how can non-executive oversight be improved to meet today's governance demands? I'm Thomas Michel. I'm your host with 25 years of experience in senior positions in internal audit and risk management for the Big Fours, and most recently as the head of internal audit and risk management at the World Economic Forum. Today, I'm excited to be joined by someone who has seen these relationships from the inside out. Gavin, who started his career as an external auditor, but has since held senior roles in internal audit at UBS, Credit Suisse, and Lloyds Banking Group. Gavin, what a pleasure to have you here today. But before we dive into today's topic, it would be wonderful if you could briefly introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thomas, it's great to be here with you to discuss some of the key questions that should be at the forefront of the minds of both internal audit and also the audit committee. And a great big hello to everyone that's listening. A little bit about me, as you said, to start with. I began my career as an external auditor aged 18, actually working with Anderson. They sponsored me through university, and then I rejoined them as I finished my studies. I was there until Enron came along, and this is a little bit of a feature of my career. I seem to have been in places that have either been taken over or have taken over other organizations. So there until Enron, where I joined Deloitte. I stayed there, but made the transition out into internal audit with a function that was being professionalized and designing a new methodology for them, putting in place all of the policies and procedures that they needed to have. Before returning, I would say, to the core of what I do, which is auditing, chief auditor roles, delivering large portfolios of audit work to executive management and to the audit committee. My career took a bit of a change in 2016. I left Lloyds Banking Group, joined Credit Suisse, and from there made the move out to Switzerland as well with my family. So having spent all of my career in the UK, I've spent the last nearly 9 years in Switzerland, enjoying everything that the country has to offer. My children going to school here and growing up. They've now spent longer growing up in Switzerland than they did in the UK. I was around with Credit Suisse through the merger with UBS. And so I find myself here today talking to you after nearly 30 years, I think, in both internal and external audit, focusing on big risks that organizations need to be dealing with.
Wow, that's amazing. And Gavin, it's so great having you here today. So, as our listeners know, we like to start with a few light-hearted questions to warm us up before we jump into the depths of today's topic. So, Gavin, what was your very first job in your life?
I guess it's a slightly difficult question, actually, Thomas, because I had, when I was growing up, 4 jobs. And so which one came first, I don't quite recall. I used to help my father a lot in a couple of businesses that he ran. He was an insurance broker, running his own business, but he also owned some clothing shops. And so I helped him in both, whether that was mailing out letters to prospective insurance clients or actually selling in the shop, and going with him to buy clothing in the East End of London and getting it all prepared to sell it. Separately from that, I worked in a bakery on Saturday mornings. So getting up from the age of 14 for a shift that started at 5 a.m, working for 7 or 8 hours, making everything from Berliner's donuts to baguettes, and learning a lot of interesting skills that I've used later in life. But yeah, another way to make a little bit of money. A couple of other things I did. I delivered leaflets and newspapers. A lot of people did in the UK at that time. And I was an indoor cricket umpire in the evenings. This was when I was a little bit older. So supervising games that people were playing and making key decisions. Who knows whether that led me into the world of overseeing, supervising and monitoring. But yeah, lots of different jobs when I was younger to earn money to, live life to the full.
Thank you. Gavin, you mentioned you are in the profession for almost about 30 years. So the second question would be, what kept your passion for internal audit alive over all these years?
Yeah, Thomas, it's a question quite a number of people have asked me over time, and the answer has stayed the same. No 2 days in the profession are the same, and it is that which has kept me always interested in auditing, always interested in looking at different risks, different subjects. I remember clearly doing a job swap, essentially, with somebody when I was working in banking. I would monitor them for a day and they would monitor what I did for a day. And at the end of seeing what I did, they said, how do you go from all these different subjects, one subject to another, a meeting on global payment systems, a discussion about human resource practices and policies, etc. And I said, but that's the thing that fundamentally keeps it really interesting. No 2 days are the same, and many different topics within the same day.
Last question of the easy ones. What would you tell your 18 years old yourself if you could turn back in time?
I'm not sure I'd put that into an easy question. What would I tell myself? I think probably 2 things. One, slightly more amusing. One, I would tell my 18-year-old self, learn German. At some point in your career, you're going to be in Switzerland, and it's going to be deeply helpful if you can speak German. As it was, I started learning when I was 40 years old, and that is much more difficult, although I think I've made some good progress. But more seriously, what would I tell myself? I think there's no such thing as magic, is what I would tell myself. And what I mean by this is, wherever you see somebody doing something that you would really like to be able to do, something where you go, wow, how did they make that happen? How did they influence that person? How did they present so well? Don't belittle your own abilities. Don't presume they're naturally talented. That must be something that only they could do. And ask them, find out how they did it, and then work at being able to do it yourself. And I think if I'd have worked that out earlier than being 18, then that would have helped me a lot during my career.
Gavin, I really like this response. So, Gavin, let's dive into today's topic, and I wanted to start with, are audit committees asking the right questions? So let's start right from the top. From your experience, Gavin, what are the most important questions that audit committees should be asking internal audit, but often don't?
I think I'd start by saying, Thomas, are they asking the right questions generally? I think audit committees absolutely are asking many of the right questions. They're focusing on the really important subjects. And I've seen over my career a real growth in that ability and capability, not least post the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and a lot of shifts that were made to improve governance. But going back even further than that, huge changes in governance and the independence of the audit committee, the non-executive directors, and the real high quality of individuals that sit around those tables with great experience. So generally, I think there's lots to be very pleased about and impressed by in terms of the questions that are asking. If I come to the second part of what you were saying, which is what should they be asking internal audit but maybe don't, then for me, the first thing that comes to mind is actually asking about the risk appetite choices that are being taken by internal audit. And what do I mean here? Well, we're in the audit life cycle from designing and embedding an audit universe, creating the audit plan with all the risk assessments that go underneath it, executing that audit plan, deciding which issues to report, which issues not to report, the reporting of that to the audit committee, the following up of issues, which issues do you follow up, which ones don't you, the timing of all of that. Those choices that internal audit make about their ways and their methods involve some real risk appetite decisions. What are those decisions? How are internal audit comfortable with those decisions is a real discussion area that I think it is valuable for an audit committee to have. If I think about, the core objective of audit committees in overseeing the effectiveness of internal audit and the appropriateness of their risk-based plan, it hones me in a little bit further into where some of the most significant decisions are made. And that is actually in creating that risk-based plan. Which audits make it to the plan and which ones don't? At what point do they make it to the plan, and which other things can be deferred? And when I was designing and implementing audit methodologies, overseeing the whole function in my professional practices roles, roles I've held in Lloyds Banking Group and Credit Suisse, those questions were always at the forefront of my mind, always in my thinking of where are we making those choices and which is the most appropriate choice for us to be risk-based, but know that we're doing the right thing. My core point on this bit would be that I would expect audit functions to want to take that information to the audit committee, to want to have that discussion with the members and to identify where their views on risk appetite align and where they might be different. I know there can be some nervousness in that we might feel as auditors very risk averse and worry that that's only going to result in more work, do more here, or we've got a different risk appetite. But I think from my experience that often, and maybe more likely, that audit committees will say, I think we're doing too much in this area and maybe we can refocus efforts to somewhere else.
Maybe some of our listeners are going to say or think, oh, that's great if you have a close relationship with your audit committee, but if this relationship to the audit committee is not that close yet, what are your thoughts to get closer or to get closer touch with the audit committee in order to be able to have such conversation with your chairman of or chairwoman of the audit committee?
I think there's lots of great opportunities, Thomas. I mean, one of the best opportunities actually is when there's new audit committee members. So the onboarding of those individuals into the organization, they're often curious, want to know about what's happening, and starting that conversation with those individuals is a great way of onboarding them, letting them know about the methodologies and the approaches, but beginning that conversation about here is where we are making choices in internal audit. And fundamentally, internal audit and the audit committee has the same aim here. Are we making those right choices and it's resulting in the most appropriate plan that we could have? It's the same risk that both parties are looking to mitigate. And so I tend to find they'll be quite receptive to that conversation.
Very good. Thank you.
I think there's a few other areas, Thomas. I mean, I've touched on one about the risk appetite. The question was broad around what other topics might the audit committee need to be more focused on. Clearly, in this moment in time, how is internal audit making the best use of the latest technological advances? And here, I mean, not just saving time on, speeding up administrative tasks to make them more efficient, but also getting the best assurance for the least amount of effort, the greatest audit opinion you can for the least effort. I'll give a quick example here. Absolutely any function could use generative AI to take the audit file, all the work that's in that file, and to produce a first draft of an audit report. And that will happen much more quickly than anyone doing it themselves. The machine types faster than we ever would, and it can analyze the information much more quickly. But for me, just if not more important is looking at what is the most appropriate scope for the audit. There's in most organizations, 10 years of information of auditing those risks before. Lots of other knowledge from individuals, and using generative AI to mine that information and to think about what risks are typically audited, what's the scope, really important. So audit committees being interested in where are we being brave with the new technologies and where else could bigger improvements be made, I think is important.
Let's talk for a minute about the potential risks associated with the AI solutions we are currently using in internal audit. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Is it the data privacy, the type of systems we are relying on, or perhaps how we are actually applying these tools in practice?
I think there's lots of risks, and actually as auditors, Thomas, we often look at those risks and it might make us think about whether we use them, whether we use those techniques at all. For me, it is inevitable that these advances will become part of everyday life for each of us. And so I think it's really important to look at what are the benefits that we can get from these advances, whilst particularly thinking about the behavioral risks that might arise. And that's I mean, absolutely data privacy. You don't want to expose data from the organization to the outside world, but inside the organization, what behavioral risks might come. How might it be the machine generates an audit report? And you really want somebody to be reviewing it, but because there's now one generated, they abdicate that responsibility and simply pass it on to be issued, rather than doing what they're paid for, which is to apply their great experience and their great knowledge to what is the best wording of this report to help influence management to do the right things on the things that the report is covering. The third area for me, Thomas, where they could ask more questions is actually around how opinions over risk and controls are changing over time. And I think this is relevant really for those timeless risks that an organization faces. And what I mean here is those risks that are going to be around forever, ever present in an organization, most likely ever evolving, and where you really need to know how the organization is keeping pace, progressing, the maturity of the control framework. Great examples are cyber risk, anti-money laundering, no doubt climate, environmental risks at this moment in time. But moving away from just the focus on point-in-time audit reporting, the annual audit summary, but looking to provide trending analysis over multi-years through internal audits approaches and how things are shifting from one year to the next. It's quite closely linked to my fourth area, which is what is the full picture of assurance across the lines of defense. Many organizations talk about getting to this overall assurance map. I don't know how many have fully achieved it. But I think there really is the opportunity for the audit committee to probe well into, do we have what I term school playground football going on? Everybody chasing the same football in the same part of the pitch, and whole areas of the pitch where there is nobody. All three lines of defense heavily focused on some risks, but other topics not getting the attention they deserve. And that's the real benefit of probing into those assurance maps and understanding. How do we look as an organization? Where could we do less and be comfortable? And where do we need to do more? Obviously, not just a question for the third line of defense internal audit, but also the other lines of defense. And finally, I'd come to, I'll give it a very brief summary here, Thomas, but maybe a topic entirely in its own right, which is I still think there's a great opportunity for many functions to have more conversations with the audit committee about the risk and control culture of the organization, where that risk and control culture is really supporting the organization to achieve its objectives, its strategic objectives, and where it is likely to get in the way of those strategic objectives and cause problems for the organization.
So, if I understand correctly, there seems to be a tendency to focus heavily on outputs like the number of audits or findings when we are reporting to the audit committee, while the underlying foundations often don't receive the attention they deserve.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely some human nature going on here. There's an audit plan that's created and it generates lots of audits being done, audit results, issues that are raised, issues that are followed up. So lots of outputs for people to focus on, lots of data points that are reported. And there's subconscious comfort in that to a large degree with when lots of things are reported, lots of good things must be happening and lots of good things are being done. But it is a skew to the outputs rather than maybe enough of a conversation on the inputs. How did we know that this was the right audit plan in the first place? I'd also draw out here, the need to get the right balance on the difference between data and management information. I'll give a very quick example. I know many audit functions report, did management successfully resolve the issues that were raised by internal audit? And they may be in a quarter go and say, in the last quarter, this many were resolved. What those data points don't tell you is necessarily when those issues were closed by management. And if you actually look to what I would call the vintages, what period of time did they come from? Where were they in the organization? You can learn a lot about which parts of the organization at which point in time had trouble, and which parts of the organization at different points in time were truly successful. And there's as much, if not more, to be learned from who was successful at what points of time and what points of stress and what did they do, and how would we replicate that to the other areas of the organization. And for me, that is just much more valuable information than in the last 3 months, 12 of these things were reviewed by internal audit, and this many were okay and this many were not.
Another great point, Gavin, which really proves your experience in your, as we say in German, Fingerspitzengefühl to what really matters. So if I come back a little bit to the first topic in relation to the risk appetite decisions being taken by internal audit, and as you mentioned, the audit universe and risk assessment topics that can sometimes feel a bit like a black box to the audit committee. So are audit committees really being shown the risk appetite decision that internal audit is embedding in their methodology? Or do they have the information to challenge those assumptions if needed?
Two great questions, Thomas. I'd add a third one if that's okay, which is, do internal audit really understand the risk appetite of the audit committee? If they're not testing those risk appetite decisions, do they really know they're aligned? But let me take each of those three in turn. Are they being shown the risk appetite decisions? In general, I don't think so. And that's why I say it's one of those areas where there's a real opportunity to expose some of those decisions to daylight and to see whether the risk appetite choices are aligned. Do they have the information to challenge those assumptions if needed? I'd rather focus on, do they have the skills? I absolutely think the audit committee has the skills to challenge those risk appetite decisions, to ask really pertinent questions about them, and to provide internal audit with more information about where their risk appetite really lies. Thirdly, do internal audit really understand the risk appetite of the audit committee? Largely, I would say yes. They should do, because on a day-to-day basis, I'd expect quite a high alignment. Lots of audits get reported, judgments about those audit ratings, judgments about individual issues. I think there would be a lot where there is a good understanding. It's a lot about the outputs again, though, and not as much on the inputs. And so just exposing the inputs to that same rigor, I think, has a lot of potential benefits.
Mm-hmm.
I know you also touched on the sort of opacity of the audit universe, the black box, and maybe even the opacity of the risk assessment processes. And as I said earlier, that, from my experience, is where I saw a lot of internal audit functions making choices about risk appetite. That could be determining what is sufficiently complete for an audit universe. What gets included in the audit universe and what doesn't. What level of granularity does it go down to? It needs to be good enough to do a solid risk assessment to generate an audit plan. It doesn't have to be every single thing that the organization does down to huge detail. What's the risk taxonomy that's used? Does it contain all of the risks that should be assessed? And particularly, I think there's interesting questions the audit committee could ask here about how wired is the internal audit function into the organization. How would it spot from the data that it receives into that audit universe, the data from conversations and meetings, and how would it know that the organization is under some stresses and strains in certain areas and therefore exposed to risks? What I'd also say here is, a really key choice that's made is at what level risk is assessed. So let me take an example here, and one of the biggest risks that I see that audit functions could be taking is as you define an auditable entity within your audit universe, are you looking at individual risks within that entity, calling them high, medium, low, or however you want to classify them? Or are you taking those risks and then summarizing it at the entity level? I'll call this the averaging effect. And so it's very easy for there to be a high risk within an entity that has other low risks, and for a methodology to average that into a medium risk. And that fundamentally changes when that high risk gets looked at. Maybe the speed, maybe the extent, maybe the nature of the procedures. And so that's a really important risk appetite decision that an organization takes. Personally, I'm always in favor of not averaging the risks, not applying any mathematical approaches to that, but to say, if I thought an entity had a high risk, I might want to look at that high risk.
I mean, Gavin, I think that's an excellent point to highlight the averaging effect of risks, because that just adds another level of depth to this conversation.
And there's, my preferred approach, Thomas, isn't necessarily what other people will need to do. There's lots of ways of solving that problem. You can say, of course, the average is amber, but we know that that unit has a high risk within it, and therefore that increases the frequency, or the timing is more speedy for us going and looking at that area. The second thing that I see happening quite often is a deferral effect, I'll call it. And so this is about the choices that internal audit functions make of when they've assigned things as being high, medium, or low, for example. When do they suggest their teams go and look at those risks? And I've seen typically people say, a high risk within 12 to 18 months, a medium risk maybe within 36 months, and maybe a lower risk, something is done every 5 years, maybe 4 years in different jurisdictions, but essentially some timing effect. And there's a really big difference for me between, do I need to go within the next 12 months, or is it only at 12 months? And so what can happen is that people use the full amount of the time that's available. And so those approaches of get there within 36 months very quickly become, I'll only go when 36 months has elapsed. And there's clear metrics you could run in an audit function to see, how long does it take from identifying it to it happening. But there's a really interesting thing for an audit function to know about itself, and maybe to have a conversation with an audit committee about.
May I ask you, looking at today's rapidly changing world, all the geopolitical challenges and tensions we have out there, is it altogether time to go completely away from an audit calendar and be completely flexible? Or if you could make a cut between how many of my audits should be nicely in my audit program and what's the percentage of my time I should have available to run flexible audits?
Yeah, two great questions in there, Thomas. I'll deal with each in turn. Firstly, the question around the getting away from a cyclical approach, if I call it that, and a truly risk-based approach. I've battled with this in my mind quite a lot throughout my career, and the way I look at it is, I think, quite straightforward. You need to have both items forefront of your mind. So you need to be able as an audit function to respond to emerging risks as they arise. I would call these high risk engagements, the things where I say, do I need to go now? The reason I wouldn't go now is if management already know about the risks, they're in exactly the same mind as we are and they're doing something about it, I'm just going to probably get in the way. But if they're not aware of it or they're not seeing that risk in the same way, then absolutely internal audit should go and do something now and help bring that to the forefront. Then I sort of get to the cyclical plan of things and go, well, of course, internal audit could end up looking really silly if there are risks that they've never been to look at, never updated their opinions on. And so naturally, there is a point in time where you say, we haven't looked at this for this amount of time. I think we should go and kick the tires and get ourselves comfortable that small incremental changes over time haven't degraded the control framework, haven't introduced new risks. And for me, that is absolutely a good thing to do where we haven't seen major shifts in risks. Go and kick the tires. But the nature and extent of those procedures should be appropriate to it being, let's go and kick the tires, as opposed to we think there is something wrong. I mean, in a perfectly controlled organization where management spot everything, there would only be a cyclical plan. There would be nothing to go and see. And that's the battle I've had in my own mind over time of what's the right balance between those two approaches.
Very, very interesting thoughts.
The second bit you raised was about buffer. And here I think there is another human behavioral tension point, I think, which is interesting, and a place where audit committees can make sure they're asking the right questions about what is the buffer available for work as it comes in. My perspective, having operated as a chief operating officer for internal audit, is it is always easier to put an audit on the plan when there is capacity to do that work than it is when the plan is already full and you're trying to do one in, one out. And so, people become attached to their audit idea, the one they put on the plan 6 months ago that they've started working on that maybe isn't as high priority as the thing that's just come along. And so it is always harder to remove some of those items than it is to have a bit of buffer available and to introduce the new work. Clearly, if nothing else came along of higher risk, you can still do that thing you thought of in the first place. You can introduce it to the plan during the year. So you're not at any disadvantage by holding it back as some part of a buffer. It's ready to go if nothing else of more importance comes along. But that mindset shift for people, I think, is pretty important.
So if I understand right, the key isn't just transparency in the process, but the transparency in the judgment. So the question is, how can we make those underlying decisions more visible so that the audit committee can effectively challenge or calibrate them? Ultimately, it's about aligning on the outcomes both internal audit and the audit committee's aim to achieve and working together to get there in the most efficient way.
Absolutely right. This is, I'd say, exposing the judgments to daylight and so that they're out in the open. It's the cleansing power of daylight, I'll call it.
So taking it a step further brings us to the non-executive side of the table. Audit committee members are often not necessarily governance experts. They are business leaders or financial specialists. So how can internal audit support them in asking better questions and truly fulfill their oversight responsibilities?
I think, Thomas, I think the first step really is internal audit thinking about those choices that they've made that could put the audit committee at risk is the first point in this conversation. And it might be having that discussion with the leadership team in the internal audit function as a first point is the best first step. What you're going to discover is which of those choices do you think are the most significant? Which ones actually amongst the internal audit leadership team make different people say, oh, are we happy that we're doing that? There will already be some good data points within the internal audit function about what might be risky. Then I think once you've got those topics, finding a way for them to be on the agenda of the audit committee. And I don't mean necessarily a fixed point on an agenda of an audit committee meeting. It could be, as we said earlier, when there's a new audit committee member and you're going through the onboarding, having some of that discussion as part of that. The pre-briefings for committees about what topics should be on the agenda could include a discussion about their interest in some of these areas with a teaser about some of those most important decisions. I think what will soon become really clear as you start those discussions is where the interest of the audit committee really lies and on which of those subjects there's a hook that gets them interested in knowing more. That might result in a deep dive by one or more of the audit committee members into that subject outside of an audit committee meeting, or it might lead to an agenda item, but some way that the mutually beneficial outcome of the audit committee knowing more about those risk appetite choices and internal audit knowing more about the risk appetite decisions that the audit committee would make, I think is a really good place for the internal audit function to want to get to.
So would you agree that helping them understand what they should be curious about is just as important as answering what they already know to ask?
Absolutely. Explore whether or not that this is a topic that they're interested in, they're curious about, and see where it heads.
Gavin, at the outset, you mentioned 4 key areas where audit committees could and perhaps should be asking more questions. 1, generative AI and its implementation. 2, multi-year assurance planning. 3, integrated assurance. And 4th and last, organizational culture. It's clear that these are critical topics requiring thoughtful oversight, and we already considering future podcast episodes to dive deeper into each of these topics. Gavin, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences in relation to asking the right questions to the audit committee and how audit committees can better oversee the work of internal audit. It's been an incredibly rich conversation, and I'm sure our listeners are leaving with powerful ideas to bring back to their boards and their organizations. But before I let you go, I have 2 final questions for you. So number 1, from your perspective, what is the one thing that our listeners should take away from today's conversation?
I think in summary, I would say, both for internal audit functions and for the audit committees, do not leave yourself exposed to the risk of misaligned risk appetites. Expose yourself to the chance of a happy accident by having the conversation. I think it is equally, if not more likely, that you'll discover some areas where there's the opportunity to take a little bit more audit risk safely, to do less work in some areas, to really be able to focus on another more important topic at this moment in time. Be brave enough to have these conversations. Expose yourself, as I said, to that chance of the happy accident. Discuss these items. It's always better to know now what someone's risk appetite is than to find out when something has gone wrong and you discover that you should have been doing things differently.
Gavin, at the start of our conversation, you spoke about your 18-year-old yourself, which brings me to the second question, which is, what kind of advice will you give to someone who is just starting out in their career as an internal auditor?
I think the bit of advice I would give, in addition to the sort of, there's no such thing in magic, is focus on the outcome. So don't get so wound up in the task and processes of everyday life and that somehow that if I follow this methodology, it must automatically generate the right outcome. Keep curious about what was the real outcome you wanted to achieve and are you achieving it? You can always change the tasks and processes to get to the real outcome that you want to get to.
Thank you, Gavin. That was amazing, and I really look forward to our next conversation. That will happen soon.
Thanks, Thomas.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. I hope this episode gave you a fresh perspective on the right questions that can be asked and how we can support the audit committee in better overseeing the internal audit function. Make sure you subscribe to Governance Unplugged, and if there is a topic you would like us to explore or a guest you would love to hear from, drop me a message on LinkedIn or visit www.keystone-governance.ch. And as always, together, let's build a stronger, more resilient organization, one conversation at a time. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep driving governance excellence.